Hey, what's up guys? Sir Emanon here, and welcome to another deck profile on the channel today. So this is going to be the deck profile for Trap Shaddolls, which is a very interesting controller deck that's been popping up quite a lot lately, especially on DB Ladder. It's super interesting, and there's a lot of different takes that you can play with the builds, so this is just going to be my personal approach, but definitely there could be optimizations made and just various different options based on what you personally prefer. So that's one of the cool things that I'll talk a little bit more about the deck as we get into it. But as usual, this is kind of the culmination and results of the Road to 1000 Olympic Rating series, where I go ahead and play this deck live and go over the replays and my decisions. So if you guys do want to go ahead and get caught up on those matches, be sure to check out the playlist. I'll leave the link in the description box below, as well as in the top right corner of the screen. But we're going to be doing another live deck building session, of course, where we start off from scratch and basically just talk through the card choices individually as we go through it. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get started. So what I like to do in these videos is just provide some general notes and a little bit of theory if you guys are interested in that kind of discussion. Of course, feel free to skip ahead. I will have the video, timestamped and things of that nature. But if you're interested in kind of just the discussion, then feel free to stick around. So first is going to be just the general overview. This is, of course, Shaddoll, so it is a very, very notorious for its kind of grind game, as well as the ability to just loop resources over and over again. The fusions are super strong at just getting you back resources that you might have lost or invested, or just intentionally dumped yourself, which is really, really awesome. And additionally, the Shaddoll monsters themselves are very sticky, especially with the inclusion of cards such as Falco. It can be very, very difficult to actually clear a Shaddoll board, and that's one of the deck's biggest strengths, and just the entire identity of the deck overall. The second is the fact that the deck aims to not only control the board state, but also simultaneously accrue advantage over time. And what I mean by this is that a lot of the traps that you're playing, I'll give a couple examples here, such as Dogmatic Punishment and Paleozoic Dynamiscus. These excel at not only hindering your opponent from making their plays, but you also can get the ability to, of course, just trigger Shaddoll effects, and that gets you further into your own engine. So not a lot of control decks really have the ability to turn their defensive cards that are out of their engine, or even that are within their engine, to cards that directly plus them. And that's what's a very unique element of this deck specifically. And the third is that this list specifically is very, very trap heavy, and it's going to be focused less on the fusions themselves. So if you want to pivot towards maybe like an Invoked build or a Magistus build or things of that nature, I'm not really playing any of those engines, but it's something that you can definitely leave to your own personal options and your own personal preferences. As I mentioned in the beginning, it's very, very much up to how you see fit, and that's something I'm going to get into a bit now. So getting into the strengths, it's kind of just piggybacking off that last point. This deck is very, very mutable and super versatile in terms of how you want to build it. And you can really change it based on the format, based on how you think the deck stacks up against other decks, and the way that you personally like to manage your resources. I think that's like one of the coolest things, is that this deck has a lot more flexibility than I think other decks do, because people who might not be as familiar with this deck, definitely might just view this as kind of like wind a turbo when you sit in it, but it really does a lot more than that. It's very, very toolbox oriented, and I think that there's a lot of other players who would view the deck in a similar regard, but can still have a bit of differences. So take this list as kind of a template. But if you want some other ideas from other Yugi tubers, I would highly suggest Pack. I'll leave a link to his YouTube channel below. He's been pioneering this deck a lot, of course. And then there's also Team Kings of Games, who is very, very much a proponent of this deck as well, who has a lot of theories and concepts of his own that you might want to incorporate. So there's a lot of differences between everybody's personal way of building this deck. This is not a deck that I think has a universal solved build, unlike something like Virtual World, for example. So you really can just make these changes as you see fit, which is one of the coolest things. Some of the hallmarks of the most competitive decks in the game's history is their ability to adapt, and I think Shaddoll is one of the best decks of doing that. The second strength here is that you can pivot well individually within a particular matchup based on how you want to prioritize resources. So if you're against a deck that really relies on the graveyard, Ariel is going to be your best friend. If you want to just start looping Dragon against backer decks, that's an option for you. Or if you really just want to outgrind your opponent, you can just start drawing a lot of cards with Beast and stuff. So there's a lot of different ways you can actually just deal with various things in the metagame, or even rogue matchups. Like you have non-targeting removal and Schism. You have Construct that can just out cards. There's a lot of very, very cool aspects, little things of the deck that can just allow you to tailor your matchup in your favor based on how you choose to play it out, of course. And then the third thing is, of course, the very strong inevitability. This deck is kind of similar to a deck like Ultrageist, where you can just create a critical mass of resources and just simply overwhelm your opponent with everything that you have. And it's really, really hard to stop when the ball gets rolling. So that's something that's really, really cool too. But we have to, of course, talk about some of the weaknesses because we got to be fair in our evaluations. So first off is the fact that this build in particular tends to be a bit slower to start. It's not as explosive. Now, you can, of course, fix this if you want to go a more fusion route. But then in that instance, you kind of lose out on some of the control tools. So it's definitely a trade-off based on how you value certain elements of the build. So I'll leave that up to you, of course. This might not be the build for you if you are into more comboing off, which is kind of funny for me to say since I, of course, like to combo myself. But this is very, very much focused on the grind game later on, especially like turn 2 onwards. So the first turn might be a bit slow to set up. You might be just be setting a couple back row and passing. But once again, the train gets going, very, very difficult to stop. The second is that this format, surprisingly, Shaddoll Fusion isn't the greatest. And what I mean by this is that you'll run into matchups like Drytron, where they'll either lock you out entirely with Vanity's Ruler, or they'll just not special from the extra at all and just end on like an ultimateness. Or you'll end up playing some like other trap matchups like Eldritch. Certain builds just don't make this card alive. So it can be difficult to actually get a lot of value of this card. But that being said, of course, it's still one of the best tools at getting you resources. So it's still a powerhouse. It's just that it's not necessarily as universal as it might have been in previous formats. And then the final thing is that some of the most powerful cards in this deck that offer really strong synergies also come with their own kind of anti-synergies and conflicts. And the engine I'm specifically referring to is the Dogmatica cards, and specifically Punishment. So Punishment, of course, allows you to get you further into your engine, which we'll talk about later, but also comes with the downside of just locking you out of the extra deck, so preventing you from getting fusion plays. Generally, this isn't a problem since you have like Schism and other cards to help you kind of just play the grind game. And if you shift your focus, like I mentioned earlier, from the fusion focus to a trap focus and own in a lot on the main deck Shaddoll monsters and their utility effects, you'll find that this isn't really that much of a problem, but it can come up if you are not accustomed or acclimated to the build. Like, for example, I was not used to kind of shifting to that playstyle, but I definitely learned to adapt as I played the deck more myself. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and now get into the actual deck profile itself. So what I typically tend to do with these deck profiles is, of course, I organize the cards by card role, and this works well a lot of the time, of course, but with trap decks, I think it's a little bit different since the deck is a lot more defensive by nature. So the cards ultimately end up switching and deviating a little bit from the norm. So I'm going to be abiding by those roles as much as I can, but we'll be making modifications as we see fit. And so we're going to begin with the starters, and here we're already going to make a bit of an adjustment, if you will. So first off, I'm going to go through what I call independent starters. These are starters that are not only one card plays by themselves that don't require any additional setup, but they also don't require the game state to be developed in a particular way. And you kind of maybe see where I'm going with this later as we get into it. But the first of these is going to be 3 copies of Nadir's Servant. Absolutely powerhouse of a card. This card allows you to go first or go second. It's alive on turn 1 or turn 10. It lets you get into your Shaddoll package by sending things like App Clone or Construct, and it gets you into another starter / extender, but I mean, it could be a starter as well in the form of Ecclesia, which ultimately nets you a copy of Punishment, which is a way to further your engine and allows you to disrupt your opponents. So the payoff for this card is huge, and this card allows you to have a lot of versatility as well, since of course you can help to break boards going second by setting stuff like Entis. This card just does it all. It gets you like a light monster for Construct too. So this card is very, very powerful. It's flexible as well when you can use it, because you can use it after you go into your extra deck plays if need be. And that's why this card obviously is super synergistic with the deck. And then we have the 1 copy of Ecclesia. You don't really actually need to play more than one of this because, of course, Nadir's Servant can recur from the graveyard. So unless this gets banished, which is unfortunate, or if you banish it yourself via Schism, if you have to, it doesn't really actually hurt that badly. And even though she is a starter, there's a lot of normal summons in this deck. And even though the game, or as the game gets later, you can special summon her more often, it still is nice to be able to actually commit more to Shaddoll plays later on. Whether it be normal summoning them or just, going for lethal pushes. But she's still really, really good to have as, of course, the way to get into the toolbox. I think Nadir's Servant is the power card, which is why you would want to max in it versus this card. Plus, the space is actually just kind of tight in this deck, so we had to slim down elsewhere. But of course, the cool thing is that something that I learned in my third game of Road to 1000 is that even if you draw these together, you can actually just normal Ecclesia, not use her effect, go into the Magistus link, and then you serve and add her back, and then special her, and then activate her at that point. So really, really cool stuff you can do. And of course, again, she's a light for construct. And then the final independent starter that I would classify is actually Sinister Shadow Games at 3. So this card is slower, obviously being a trap, but this card allows you to accelerate your engine really, really well by sending cards like, of course, Wendy or Squamata. Just a very, very all-around useful and versatile card. It can also be defensive. It serves multiple roles, which is super good. It also can send any Shaddoll card, meaning that you can send things like Fusion or El Shaddoll Fusion, Schism, Res Shaddoll, etc. And you can help get into your more aggressive plays too. So this card allows you to just facilitate whatever the game state demands, and that's something that's really powerful to have in a card that I would classify as well as starter. The cool thing as well is that it's not once per turn, which is really nice. So if you need to use it for defensive purposes, such as going for aerial to banish stuff or sending dragon, things like that, you can just flip up multiple copies, and that's very, very strong. So these 7 cards all can operate by themselves. They don't need any other setup, and they're all very, very strong payoffs. Now, the next cards are going to be what I call the conditional starters, and these are going to be cards that help you start your engine, but require the game state to be developed to a certain degree. So first off, we got 3 copies of Dogmatica Punishment. So this card actually is a starter in a way, because of course it can also, like Nadir Servant, just send you the app clone and get you into your Shaddoll plays. The thing is that, of course, your opponent needs to have a face-up monster on the board. So it, of course, is going to be primarily a defensive card. But that being said, it still is a lot of the times a starter. If your opponent doesn't actually manage to push past the rest of your disruptions, you can really capitalize by just utilizing this to get into your engine a lot quicker. And the biggest downside of this card, of course, is just that extra deck restriction, which definitely can hinder your ability to make aggressive pushes with especially like El Shaddoll Fusion. However, because this is, again, a trap deck, you can go into things like Schism very easily and bypass that. So it's generally not too big of a deal. You really do want the Dogmatica package to just carry you throughout the grind game, since it'll allow you to, again, accelerate your resources while hindering your opponent at the same time. So that's ultimately the goal of what you want in a card like this. And then the next conditional starter, I would say, is the 3 copies of Shaddoll Fusion. So this is something that I mentioned is not really actually super amazing universally, this format. When it resolves and you get to actually play the game the way that you would ideally want to with this card, it's amazing, of course. But there are also situations where this card does not have the ability to be live in certain cases, depending on the matchup, or even if you're just going first, there's just times where you can't activate it, which is unfortunate. I was actually catching one of Pack's streams the other day, and he was, believe it or not, cutting this card down to 2 and siding the third one. And honestly, I was considering when I was starting out, actually, the first draft, I was putting in 1 fusion and siding the other 2. But I thought people would probably just yell at me if I did that. But honestly, I would probably, not be opposed to still doing something like this. Because the thing is that, right, like you are aiming to go first. This card is very, very easily tutorable, because anytime you have access to like a punishment or Nadir Servant or what have you, you're able to just search this and then just dump something else, right? Or you can send it to the grave via Shadow Games, get it back. There's like a lot of ways to interact with this card and get access to it. You don't have to actually hard open it that much. And when you do hard open it without Shaddolls, then it just becomes a dead card. So there's actually a case for this to be cut down. And that's something that I would definitely consider. But I definitely understand that, for the purposes of this still having a bit of a fusion component that, helps to actually win the game, this is still really, really important. And against a lot of rogue matchups, this card still puts in a lot of work. It's just against like the other trap decks at times where this card isn't live, or specifically Drytron is kind of tricky. But even in its virtual world, if they VFD you, depending what attribute they call, you actually still have some leeway, since of course they can only call 1 attribute, and you should always have varying different ones or different types of attributes. So like Wendy's a wind and Ariel's a water. So you definitely can use that to your advantage to bypass VFD to at least a certain extent. So that's really, really cool. So next up, we got the extenders. This is where it kind of gets a bit murky as far as what becomes what, or what can be classified as which category. But we have 3 copies of Squamata, which is effectively just any Shaddoll, just as a way to extend via things like your Shadow Games or like your Dynamiscus, which we'll get to later, or whatever cards that can just send this. Similarly, or Wendy or gets you access to whatever you need to have. So those are very, very similar cards. They function and perform very, very similar roles in terms of just toolboxing the rest of your deck. So that is why they are the superior extenders in my mind. And then we have kind of additional extenders. We have the one copy of Falco and the one copy of Hedgehog. We actually should probably switch these. So the Hedgehog is one that I would probably like to up in an ideal case, but space is quite tight. I do want to keep this to 40 just because the concentration of powerful starter cards, as you can see, is a bit low. And granted, that's not a big deal since a lot of times you're just going to be setting a lot of traps anyways. So again, that's why card rules kind of perform differently in a trap deck like this. But that being said, of course, Shaddoll Hedgehog is one of the ways that you still can toolbox the rest of your deck. Great to set off of Wendy to get you access to your Shaddoll Fusion. That's another way you can just easily get this to to your grip. So again, it's not really that detrimental if you did opt to just play one of this. I would not really call it that crazy, even though some people would think it maybe a little bit sacrilegious, if you will. But yeah, Falco is also really good in this deck specifically, just because, especially against like a lot of the other trap decks, you want to have recursive abilities so that you can just constantly pressure the board. And this card allows you to do that by having just contributions to the inevitability that I described earlier, whether it just be bringing itself back over and over again, or just bringing your fusions back. Super, super strong. And then the next cards are going to be, of course, the 2 copies of Schism, and then the 1 copy of the Resh. So these cards are also kind of extenders in their own right, but they fulfill multiple roles. Schism in particular helps you, of course, out cards. It's like an out to Dragoon, for example. So it's really nice to have there, but it also is like an extender in the sense that you can readily just have availability to like trigger Cross Sheep or just get extra potential damage on board against opposing monsters, or just get you into Construct, which in and of itself is just a big extender. So definitely a card that you want to be prioritizing. Honestly, I get access to Schism more than I do Shaddoll Fusion, so it makes sense that I would want to play more Schism than Fusion, right? Because it's a card that I want to see more often a lot of the time. But then Resh is also a really good card that allows you to, again, especially in the control matchups, similar to Falco, get you access to just recurring threats over and over again. Rarely do I ever actually banish this card to make use of its other effect, but it does combo well with Aerial, which is super, super nice when it comes down to it. That typically doesn't happen until you're actually ready to push for lethal. But that being said, this looping with Construct or App Clone pretty much indefinitely allows you to just have an almost unmatched grind game, which is super, super great to have. And then we also have the El Shaddoll Fusion. This is kind of an extender in its own right. It really has the biggest utility of just being able to like dodge targeting effects, or just putting extra damage in the battle phase. The versatility of being a quick play spell is what makes this card definitely unique. And it is very similar to Shaddoll Fusion a lot of the times, especially when you're going first, right? Like on your turn 1, these cards are functionally almost the same, except this card's arguably better if you want to just set it. But I mean, ultimately, right, like you could just toolbox into the fusions whenever you need to. So it's generally not that hard to access them, especially because the Dogmaticas are super, super adept at getting you access to whatever you need via App Clone or Construct. And then we have now the utility cards. So we're going to get into the rest of kind of the Shaddoll toolbox. So we got a copy of Shaddoll Beast, which is really strong. Being able to summon off Wendy if you are in a very simplified game state, because this puts you farther ahead than your opponent when they are already struggling to out your resources. So this is like one of the ways we could just draw into powerful traps and then, ditch a Squamata or a Wendy and get even further ahead. So it can often just be a way to, close out the game by itself. Not through damage necessarily, but just through sheer pressure. And then we have, of course, the Shaddoll Dragon. This is just a way to out back row. Not really too much to say. I mean, the flip effect could come up, especially with Sinister Shadow Games, but realistically, it's your way that you can contend with the back row matchups a bit more. And then we also have the 1 copy of Aerial, which you could put in the extender category as well to some degree, because of her flip effect, which combos super well with, again, the Resh and the banished, the graveyard effect of Resh, which is really good if you want to, again, go for the cross sheep lines, which don't happen super often, but it's nice to have that as a bit of a tool at your disposal. But yeah, this card is really good in this format. I shouldn't have to explain it too much. It's super strong against VW and Drytron, and is one of the biggest reasons why people are looking at this deck right now is this card specifically. I was playing this card at 2 for a while. It was good at 2 for sure. It's just, again, space is very much an issue here. I don't really like increasing the card count in trap decks a lot of the time, just because, again, you have trouble finding your power cards as is. So you really just want to, have the ability to see your strongest cards ASAP, and then have your toolbox cards just be accessible at any given point. And the thing with Dragon and Aerial is that you're able to just continually get them back, through things like summoning them back off of Incarnation or Falco, or of course Apcalone, just adding them from grave to hand and then dumping them right back. So these definitely are not just one-ofs in terms of like how much you can use them in a game. You can use these a lot of times in a game. Definitely comes up, and it's really important to just take advantage of that graveyard recycling power. And then finally, this is kind of a change from the last draft that I had for the Road to 1000 Dueling Book rating series episodes, but I actually am switching over to the one copy of Trap Shaddoll Chaos. This card objectively is not very good, but it is a searchable light monster. I was finding that Trick Clown, which is the card I replaced this for, really didn't actually come up that much, because like unless if you were going for like a dedicated Shaddoll Fusion going second, and you're summoning out your Trick Clown, and you're going for your Construct, and then going to Cross Sheep, and all of that gets uninterrupted, and you go for the whole Resh aerial play, like sure, then that's fine, but at that point you're probably already winning if your opponent had no way to deal with any of it, which is not really that realistic, I feel, especially because you're doing that oftentimes going second. So because of this, this card allows you to get easy access to a light monster pretty much at all stages of the game. Be it through Hedgehog or again through Apcalone or whatever. Even like Wendy summoning it can be fine. So yeah, this card doesn't really have an effect that much, but it is very useful for what it is rather than for what it does. And then finally, we have the defense. So first, we got Paleozoic Dinomischus at 3 copies. This card, again, follows the role of punishment where you can progress your game state while still simultaneously dealing with your opponent's resources, because of course it discards for effect, which means that you trigger all your Shaddolls. So this card allows you to just out problem cards. Also, because it is a trap deck, you can bring this card back and it helps you to apply pressure that way too, just being extra link material. So this card obviously is very, very strong in this deck for sure. Especially because you're more likely to, draw like one of your 6 ways or one of your 6 good discard outlets, I should say, for this card. And then next is 3 copies of Torrential Tribute. This card is super good because it, again, fulfills kind of the idea that you can have your resources float, so you can still accrue advantage while wiping your opponent's board. So very, very good. It combos pretty nicely with just, any of your like good floating Shaddolls. Like it's even fine with like Falco, for example. But things like, Wendy or Squamata or Hedgehog, if like somehow those are on board, pretty nice stuff. And Aerial too, actually. So very, very good card here. And then the next card is one that's not synergistic necessarily with the engine itself, but it's good as kind of a supplement to the deck. So that's 3 copies of Solemn Strike. This is more of a way to push your plays through. Whether it be, if you're going second, you're facing down a board, you set traps, you want one of your traps to be strike. That way, if you, use like say a TT or Dinomischus to help clear a threat, you can strike whatever negation or response they have to it. So that's like the primary purpose of this card, but also just a good overall solid, just all around defensive card. And then finally, you'll notice we have 2 spots left, and this is kind of the flex spot. So I just threw in 2 copies of Ash here because, it's just a good way to like round out the deck. Covers for the weakness of just mass back removal to some extent. Obviously, you would probably want to slide into more hand traps, which we'll get into a bit later, but this card overall serves very, very nice purposes. Next up, we're going to now move into the extra deck, which is actually quite straightforward. So we got, for the extra deck, the Shaddoll Fusions. So we got 3 copies of Apcalone, 3 copies of Construct, and 2 copies of Winda. So you want to have a lot of these because you're sending them constantly with Nadir Servant or the Dogmatic Punishment. So even if you're not summoning 3 Constructs in a game or 3 Apcalone in a game, you definitely want them to just be resources from the extra deck as a toolbox, right? That's kind of the name of the game. So like Apcalone really becomes just any Shaddoll trigger. Construct is just the ultimate recursion tool. And if you ever are able to summon these monsters, then you're already really, really in a good spot. And you are probably going to win that game because that means you made it out of the early game. and that's probably the deck's weakest point. So like once you're able to actually navigate out of there and summon these, then you're in a very, very good spot. Winda is here. Obviously, it's a very good floodgate monster, but typically, if you're playing the deck like in terms of trying to amass and maintain resource advantage, you're trying not to actually summon this card that much. Because of the fact that again, it's just more advantageous to like use your schism for construct, and then push plays through, and then just get damage on board if need be. Like this is like needed if you like actually have to buy turn or buy time rather to just stop your opponent and then get resources like manually, like a lot more slowly, which is not the ideal case scenario. So this card actually, I'm not going to say win is bad or anything, but this card definitely is more of a backup plan than anything else. Of course, against certain matchups, it can just be like an auto win, but definitely keep it in mind that some decks just have native outs to it. Other decks, it doesn't really do a whole ton. So like, don't be too fixated on Winda, just keeping that in mind. Next is going to be the one copy of Entis. This works, of course, with the Dogmaticas. Not much to say here. And then we're going to go into our links. So we got the Magistus link, Artemis, who is strong because any of your monsters turn into just a free light. So that's really, really good. And that is the primary purpose, is just helping to banish a light for Schism without having to burn through Ecclesia. So that's really, really good. And then next is another utility card in Gravity Controller, which helps you just get your fusions into the graveyard more. And also is like nice to out certain problem monsters, like Avamax, for example, can be a little bit of a headache. So this is nice for dealing with that. And then we have of course, one copy of Cross Sheep. This card is super good at just helping you win the game. Typically, if I'm summoning this card, I'm going for a really, really big push. And that's going to help you, just end the game ASAP. And next is actually the regular Shaddoll Construct. I'm talking about the Link monster. This card's actually really, really good. It just allows you to not only get your access to El Shaddoll Construct more because it is a light, but it keeps coming back. And like that's what allows you to really just take advantage of the recursion element. It's like another kind of Falco type card or a Resh type card where it's a continual threat that your opponent has to respect and it demands an answer. It reminds you of like other cards and other decks that like continue to come back, like the double-headed Anger Knuckle in like train decks. Like that card comes back every turn. So does this card. And this card just helps facilitate like a lot of offensive plays. So it's kind of niche in its application, but when it comes up, it's really, really good to have. And then next is just a generic Link 3 to be able to toolbox, which I chose Nightmare Unicorn. You can play like Phoenix or even Celine because we do also play the access code. Celine access code is very nice, of course, but I opted for Unicorn just because it provides an out that the rest of the deck doesn't have yet, which is just like spinning back or spinning monsters. Very, very useful stuff. So that is it for the main and the extra deck. Now we'll go ahead and talk about some just alternative cards that you might want to include if you are interested in that. So first off is Mathematician. This card actually I really do like, and I would want to fit it in here somewhere. You could possibly like maybe cut Ash for it. It is another very strong normal summon. It fits in the theme because the floating effect to draw a card is definitely relevant. Like every single resource matters. And it's just nice to be able to toolbox and get you a bit into your Shaddoll plays somewhat faster. So if you want more starter cards, if you're finding that this is not enough, definitely this is a good option to consider. Would recommend at least trying out for sure. Next is kind of the engines I was talking about before. So you can play like an invoked package, or you can play the Magistus package as well. Like these are definitely fine to play if you were going a more fusion heavy route, and in those cases I would definitely recommend maxing out Shaddoll Fusion and probably play more El Shaddoll Fusion too. But I'm not really opting for that because again this is more of a trap centralized build, so I opted not to go for them. Next is more of the Dogmaticas. So you could opt to play Fleur-de-Lis or Maximus. Maximus is kind of risky, of course, as everyone kind of knows. It's a really, really big gamble, especially game one. But this could be a pretty good payoff if you want to like side it maybe for later games, just because it can be a bit of a blowout if you are just trying to set up very, very powerful boards. And then Fleur-de-Lis is a good out to Dragoon, which is nice. It's also just another body and another way to apply pressure and a way to make your Dogmatica package just a little bit more threatening. So these are options for sure that you can play if you want to. Next is the Trick Clown, which I kind of briefly mentioned before, I was playing this card. It's not a bad card for sure. It's fine to send off like your Shaddoll Fusion, but again, I'm not focusing super much on that card specifically. So I figured my light target might as well just be accessible at any point, whether it be through and like I can fuse with a light, just not having to be from my main deck in particular. So if I wanted to fuse, via L or via Schism, like Kaios is just a lot better to do that since you can get access to it far easier. However, this card, of course, is just a very, very strong extender if you want to go for more aggressive cross-shape lines. So that is definitely something to consider. That next thing is something that might sound crazy, but it's something that I saw people test, and that's actually Pot of Duality. Now, this seems crazy, right? Because like, oh, you're a Fusion Summoning deck, and it's like, oh, you have like Wendy, and you have ways to special. It's true, but turn one a lot of the time, like if you play a deck that's close to this list, which is trap focused, not really focused on like the fusion package, you'll find a lot of the time that you don't special summon really turn one. So you can get away with actually running duality and just trying to dig for your Nadir Servant specifically. So this is kind of like an interesting tech choice. It's not one that I really enjoyed when I thought about it, but it's definitely something to kind of consider. Next is definitely the one I'm going to probably be asked about the most, which is going to be Super Poly. So Super Poly is really good in this deck, of course, because you can pretty much wipe at least one monster on your opponent's board based on what attributes they're running, of course. The thing with this card is that you have to minus yourself a fair bit. And it's true that you get that advantage back oftentimes because, especially if you're going for Construct, or you can get like Construct and like Squamata / Wendy. So you do get some of your value back. The problem is that there's like also just other decks that don't care about Super Poly that much. We're talking about like Virtual World, for example, because like even though you could like draw phase player priority does exist, not really for Shaddolls because there's not really a way to put Shaddolls onto the field in the draw phase, right? So they're always going to be resolving VFD, and even still, like at that point, you can still go for like Shaddoll Fusion, and that's still okay. And like using it as an interruption against that matchup is not great either. It's pretty cool against Drytron, so like maybe if you're running into a lot of Drytron, this could be decent. I don't really think you need to actually Super Poly away against Eldritch. I don't really think that's that great. You really cannot grind that deck pretty well. I think the key to that deck is really just resolving Aerial a bunch. But yeah, this card is like fine for sure. It's not a bad card. I just think that in terms of trying to maintain as many resources as possible, you could go for other cards that can also help break boards. Like Servant also helps break boards. But you're able to actually, kind of go for a more reserved approach in the event that like your hand doesn't actually allow you to utilize this optimally, right? Because you have to have a discard that's like, something that's okay, and it's a cost too, so it's not like you trigger Shaddolls off that. And also like a way to get Shaddoll on the board, which is not the hardest thing in the world to accomplish. It's just that I think it's a lot of resource investment. And if you're not like getting Construct out of it specifically, then it can definitely be rough. Next is going to be just traps in general. So things like Ice Dragon's Prison and then Trap Trick. These are kind of the big ones. Honestly, I didn't really find space for Trap Trick. I'm not playing that many. Well, I'm playing a fair amount of normal traps, but I just didn't want to incorporate Trap Trick. I'd rather just play actual more defensive cards. Just because like the engine takes up a fair bit of room, being the Shaddolls, there's 3, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 Shaddoll monsters. So that's like quite a bit of the engine, and then you have like the spells and traps to play as well. So I figured that like even though you could get more access to whatever trap you want at the time, which could serve to be like another starter or another like disruption tool, I just figured that I'd rather just have those tools at my disposal to begin with, and like just have more diversity, right? Because like you could cut Ash again for this, but I do like the fact that Ash does stuff in this deck that the other cards don't do. So again, just having like varied disruptions is nice. And then Ice Dragon's Prison is something I had in here for a while. That's what the Ashes used to be. And then I cut it because I ultimately have been liking this card a bit less this format as time has gone on, especially as Drytron and VW continue to kind of become more popular. So that's it for kind of the alternatives. And then for the side deck, this is really just up to how you think your side deck should be based on your metagames. So this is kind of just a template. But if I was playing in like a tournament setting, I'd probably side something like Cycle Reader to deal with Drytron. I'd side Nibiru to deal with combo decks. I would go for Cosmic to deal with like the backward decks. You could also play Heavy Storm Duster if you wanted to. There's Feather Duster. There is Call by the Grave, which is a nice like generic defensive card. And then there's Pankratops, which is a good like generic go second card. And then the last 3 cards could be kind of just depending on what you think is missing. Bell could be a good option. You could also play like Meister, or you could play like DD Crow, or you could just play like other traps. There's like a lot of different options. Of course, the side deck is really flexible, and it can be what you want it to be. I also just realized as I'm kind of looking through my OBS window that the card preview isn't working. So that's been like that the entire video. That is awkward. Whatever. We're gonna roll with it. I'm probably just gonna put a static picture of like Construct there on the right, so you guys will never know until you hear this part of the video. But that's gonna do it for the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave a like as well as any thoughts or your feedback in the comments. Subscribe for more informative and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh content. If you want to, you can follow me on all social media platforms or support me via Patreon TCG Player. All the links in the description as usual. And until next time, I'll catch you in the next video. See you guys.